The last thing Leonidas of Sparta remembered was the taste of blood and ash upon his tongue. The sky above Thermopylae had burned red with dust and the screams of dying men, and the world had narrowed into the iron certainty of shield, spear, and the relentless press of the Persian tide. His muscles were torn, his breath a rasp dragged from a shattered chest, yet he stood. He always stood. Around him, his brothers fell one by one, not as men, but as living walls of bronze and defiance. The pass had become a grave of broken shields and crimson earth. Then the world tore. It was not a fading into darkness, nor the gentle claiming of death's hand. It was violence, raw and impossible. Lightning without storm split the air, not white, but a sickly, unnatural hue of purple and blue that bled like a wound in the sky itself. The ground beneath his sandaled feet shattered into nothing, and for the first time in his life, Leonidas felt no earth. He fell upward. The roar of battle was ripped away and replaced with a vast, soundless emptiness. The stars stared at him, endless, merciless, cold. The heavens that his people had worshipped had become an endless wound of light and darkness, swirling like a great cosmic sea. The air burned from his lungs, yet he did not suffocate. His blood did not freeze. Something held him between existence and oblivion, as though unseen hands refused to let him die. Voices, distant and warped, crawled through the void. They were not the voices of gods he knew. They were layered, countless, screaming and whispering all at once, as though 1,000 dead civilizations begged for recognition. Some promised glory, some promised peace, some promised that everything he had ever believed in was a beautiful lie. Leonidas bared his teeth at the emptiness, reached for his spear that was no longer in his grasp, and roared defiance into the infinite dark. A wound of light tore open before him. Metal screamed. He was thrown from the void and slammed against iron so cold it burned. The air was thick with oil, rot, and something bitter that stung the senses. Gravity returned like a hammer, crushing him against a grated deck that vibrated with the growl of unseen engines. Above him, a ceiling of pipes and chained cables dripped filth. Flickering crimson lights pulsed weakly, bathing everything in the color of fresh wounds. Leonidas rose. His body still bore the scars of Thermopylae. His armor, though dented and torn, clung to his frame as if it too refused to surrender. The bronze was stained not only with Persian blood, but with something else now. Black oil, frost, and the faint taste of ozone. This place was not a tomb. It was a beast of metal, wounded but alive. The corridor stretched before him in both directions, a ribcage of iron ribs and snarling conduits. The walls were etched with skulls, chains, and grim symbols carved into the metal like prayers made with knives. He felt watched, not by eyes, but by a presence buried into the structure itself, old and weary and hateful. From somewhere far away came the distant thunder of explosions. The sound was deeper than any siege engine. It was the voice of a world-scale war being waged beyond his sight. The deck shuddered underfoot, and a low, mournful siren began to wail, rising and falling like a wounded animal calling to a master who would never answer. He moved forward, step by cautious step, bare feet silent upon the cold steel. A doorway yawned open to his left. Inside he saw a cathedral made of machinery. Rows of towering iron coffins wired to sputtering consoles, robed corpses seated upon thrones of cables, their hands permanently grafted into control panels. Candles burned before their desiccated faces, the flames guttering as the ship trembled. The smell of burning incense clung thickly in the air, mixing with old blood and cold metal. These were not priests of Zeus or Ares. These were something far older and far more broken. Leonidas felt the weight of 1,000 unseen years press upon his shoulders. His world, his war, his sacrifice. All of it felt suddenly small before this vast, rotting monument to endless conflict. And yet, deep within his heart, the same fire that had held the pass against Persia burned still. Another tremor shook the ship. Somewhere closer now came the rhythmic thunder of boots striking metal. Not running, not panicked, measured, disciplined, accompanied by the sharp mechanical clack of weapons being readied. Leonidas stepped into the corridor once more, reaching for a sword that was no longer there, clenching empty fists as if they held bronze and iron. He did not know where he stood. He did not know what horror had claimed him. But he knew one thing with absolute Spartan certainty. Wherever war existed, he would meet it head-on. The shadows at the end of the passage thickened, resolving into looming silhouettes of armored figures carrying rifles as long as spears and helms shaped like grinning skulls. And as their weapon lights flicked on and fixed upon him, a single question burned in the ancient king's mind, sharper than any blade. Had he been taken by gods or by something far worse? The lights mounted upon the skull-faced helms flared brighter, burning white through the drifting haze of incense and oil smoke that filled the corridor. Leonidas did not move back. He shifted his stance, feet braced upon the trembling deck, shoulders rolling as though expecting the familiar weight of a bronze shield upon his arm. Instead, his hands closed upon empty air, fingers flexing as if memory alone could conjure iron. The armored figures advanced. Their boots struck the metal flooring in perfect rhythm, a sound like a war drum beaten by machines. Their armor was heavy and angular, painted a dull, battle-worn green. Scratches and dents marked every surface, and purity seals of parchment and wax fluttered from their pauldrons, inscribed with prayers in a jagged, unfamiliar tongue. Their weapons were not bows nor spears, but brutal iron tubes with chains of ammunition feeding into their sides. "Unknown contact," one of them said, his voice distorted by Vox grill and static. "Human pattern, unregistered. Possible warp exposure." Another raised his weapon higher. "Hold, he is unarmed." They stopped several paces away from him, forming a wide semicircle. Leonidas could smell them now. Sweat recycled through ancient armor, machine oil, fear masked by discipline. They faced him as men face a thing that should not exist, yet might still be killed. He understood none of their words, but he understood their posture. Warriors, nervous but trained. He placed a fist to his chest, then extended his open palm outward. A Spartan's gesture, peace offered, but never begged. The corridor shuddered again, more violently now. Somewhere above, metal screamed as though enormous claws were tearing at the hull. The ship groaned like a wounded giant, every bulkhead whispering of imminent death. A reddish emergency gloom spread across the metal surfaces, deepening the shadows clinging to every corner. A harsh new sound cut through the air, the bark of a separate voice, sharper, colder. "Stand down." The soldiers lowered their weapons a fraction as another figure approached. This one wore a long black coat over reinforced carapace armor. A peaked cap cast his face in shadow, but his eyes burned with a fanatical focus. At his hip hung a sword whose blade crackled faintly with caged lightning. He studied Leonidas as a man might study a relic pried from forbidden earth. "You are not of this century," the man said. "You are not of this war." Leonidas met his gaze without flinching. If this was a king, then he would face him as an equal. If this was a priest, then he would not kneel. My duty, the man continued, is to decide whether you are miracle or infection. He gestured to the soldiers. They stepped closer, though their weapons remained lowered, trembling slightly in their gauntlets. Leonidas allowed them to approach. If this was to be his death, he would not dignify it with fear. One of them produced a small buzzing device and pressed it close to Leonidas's bruised skin. It bit like a wasp, and a brief flare of pain crawled along his veins. The man in black watched a flickering screen built into his wrist. No mutation, he murmured. No visible taint. Blood oxygen levels elevated. Musculature beyond baseline human norms, but not abhuman. He studied Leonidas anew, this time with something like reluctant awe. Where are you from? He demanded. Leonidas understood none of the sounds, but he understood the demand. He struck his fist to his chest once more. Leonidas, he said, his voice raw and gravelled with old blood. Sparta. The word seemed to mean nothing to them. It hung in the air and then fell away, weightless. Another tremor rocked the vessel, stronger than before. From somewhere, deep within the ship, came the distant howling of something vast and hungry, a sound that did not belong to machines or men. The man in black turned sharply. We have lost Geller field stability. Warp pressure rising. A soldier whispered a prayer. Emperor, preserve us. Leonidas felt the word like a strange pressure in the air. Emperor. A god name spoken not with love or joy, but with raw terror. He followed their gaze upward, toward the unseen heart of the ship, and he felt it then. Not a voice, not a thought, but a presence so vast that it made Olympus seem like a pebble against an ocean. A distant, burning will bound in iron and wires, watching a galaxy drown in blood and screaming silently. Something that was not a god. Something far worse. The man in black met Leonidas's eyes again. You have been spared by the master of mankind, he said. Whether that mercy was a blessing remains to be seen. The floor lurched. The lights guttered. The howling from the depths grew louder, closer, like claws scraping along the walls of reality itself. Leonidas straightened his spine and squared his shoulders, heart burning with a familiar, ancient fire as the ship groaned and buckled around them. If this emperor had drawn him from death and cast him into this nightmare, then he would meet this new war as he had met his last. But as the air turned cold and the walls began to frost, a darker thought clawed its way into his mind. Had he been rescued, or simply chosen as a weapon by a distant, dying god? The cold of the ship did not leave Leonidas when they took him from the corridor. It sank into him, as deep as any blade wound, and lingered in his bones long after the thunder of the warp had faded into a distant, hateful memory. They marched him through passages that narrowed and widened like the insides of a great metal carcass, past chanting servitors and iron-grated chapels filled with whispering priests. Arms ended in drills, eyes replaced by dim lenses, mouths wired shut in permanent prayers. He did not recoil, though his heart grew heavier with every step. These were not men corrupted by luxury or weakness. These were men sacrificed to something that never loved them. At last, they delivered him into a chamber that smelled of burned propellant and unwashed bodies. Benches lined the walls, bolters racked in tight gleaming rows. Helmets sat upon tables like rows of skulls awaiting flesh. And everywhere men, dozens of them, young, old, broken, scarred. Some stared at him openly, others pretended not to. None looked truly at peace. The man in the black coat spoke briefly to an officer in heavier armor, his words clipped and cold. There was no warmth in their exchange, only the grinding certainty of duty. A final nod. Then the door sealed behind him, leaving Leonidas alone among soldiers. Silence stretched. Then came laughter, nervous, dry. "Look at him," someone muttered. "He looks like a parade statue." Another voice, quieter, almost reverent. "No, he looks like a corpse that forgot to lie down." Leonidas ignored them. He moved to the center of the chamber and stood as he had stood 1,000 times before battle, back straight, chin lifted, eyes forward. Around him, the soldiers shifted, uncomfortable, unsure whether to mock him or fear him. A man approached. His face was scarred, one eye clouded white, his armor older than some of the men wearing it. He held a canteen and offered it without speaking. Leonidas took it. The liquid inside was bitter, metallic. It tasted like rusted rain and old pipes, but it was water, and that was enough. He inclined his head in thanks. The man did not smile, but he seemed to nod to himself, as though some private judgment had been made and passed. "They say you walked out of the warp," the man said at last, "that you breathed in it and didn't die." Leonidas did not answer. He had no words for the madness that had taken him. "They say the commissar didn't order you shot," the man continued. "That's rarer." There was a sound then that Leonidas recognized even without knowing the machines. A thunderclap trapped inside iron. The chamber shook faintly as distant guns fired somewhere beyond the bulkheads. The men stiffened, faces hardening, hands tightening around straps and weapons. War was close. A vox speaker crackled overhead. Orders were barked in sharp, metallic words. The soldiers moved with sudden purpose, pulling on helmets, checking power packs, snapping bayonets into place with ritual precision. Leonidas watched. This was not the loose, shouting chaos of Persian hordes. This was not the noble clashing of shield walls. This was something else entirely, cold, systematic, distant from glory. These men did not expect to live. They expected to delay death by minutes, perhaps seconds. The scarred man looked back at Leonidas. "If you're going to die with us, at least don't scream." He shoved a weapon into Leonidas's hands. It was heavier than a spear, colder than any blade. The grip bit into his palms. The trigger rested under his finger like the promise of thunder. He did not know how it worked, but he understood its purpose immediately. Death delivered at distance. The door at the far end of the chamber slammed open. A blast of hot chemical air washed over them. Smoke, screams, the smell of burned flesh and sacred oil. They stepped into a corridor where the lights had gone blood red and the walls were slick with condensation. Somewhere ahead came the inhuman shriek of something that had never known sunlight. Leonidas moved with them. They took positions behind broken machinery. They knelt as one. They aimed down a corridor that stretched into flickering darkness. When the first shapes emerged, wrong and twisted, men opened fire. The sound was deafening. Not a crack, but a roar, like thunder chained inside metal. Bolter shells screamed through the air, exploding into wet, violent bursts upon impact. Flesh and bone and something darker burst apart under the onslaught. Leonidas fired. The recoil nearly tore the weapon from his hands, but he stood firm. Each shot was a hammer strike, each detonation a brutal final answer. He did not think of tactics. He thought only of holding the line. Men screamed. Something screamed louder. The corridor filled with steam, blood, and drifting fragments of butchered horror. When the last of the shapes fell silent, the smoke thinned, and the bolters fell quiet. A few men laughed. Others stared, hollow-eyed. No one celebrated. The scarred soldier glanced at Leonidas again. "You didn't flinch," he said. Leonidas lowered the weapon slowly, feeling its lingering heat in his grip. All around him stood men who fought without hope of honor, without songs to sing, without homes to return to. They fought because if they did not, everything ended. And in that moment, he understood something terrible. These men were not warriors of glory. They were walls of flesh, raised against the end of all things. As the ship trembled around them and distant, deeper impacts thundered through the hull. Leonidas wondered in silence if even Sparta could have endured a war without end, and if such men could truly be led, or only spent. The silence after battle was never truly silent. It breathed. It lingered in the air like a living thing, thick with the scent of burned propellant, scorched metal, and the copper tang of blood that no scrubbing would ever fully erase. Leonidas stood among the men as they returned to their positions. Their movements slower now, their eyes duller. There was no triumph. There was only survival, measured in breaths stolen from the void. They did not speak of what they had slain. They only prepared for what would come next. He stayed with them as the wounded were dragged away, as corpsmen moved through the ranks with dull blades and hissing injectors, pruning the living from the dead with clinical indifference. Prayers were murmured as casually as curses. Hands traced tequilas across breastplates, and small metal charms were kissed and tucked beneath armor before being sealed away. The emperor was everywhere, not as a warm presence, not as a loving gaze, but as a constant weight pressing down upon every thought. His symbol was carved into the walls, stitched into banners, burned into flesh. A skull crowned by iron wings repeated endlessly, like a reminder that even death must kneel. When the order finally came, they marched, not to rest, but deeper into the ship. Leonidas walked beneath arches lined with thousands of tiny candles, their flames guttering in the recycled air. Incense poured from bronze censers swung by silent, hooded figures. It smelled of ash and myrrh, of dust and rotting sweetness. The walls here were carved with wars he could not name. Men in hulking armor standing atop mountains of skulls, cities falling under apocalyptic fire, monstrous shapes torn apart by shining blades. These were not decorations. These were not warnings. These were holy texts, carved in steel. They entered a vast chamber that rose upward like the inside of a cathedral built for a dead giant. At its center stood an iron altar linked to cables thicker than tree trunks. Upon it lay a book bound in something that had once been flesh. Dozens of soldiers stood in rows, weapons stowed, hands crossed over chests. Leonidas stood among them. A priest emerged, his robes heavy, his face replaced by a golden mask shaped like a screaming skull. His voice echoed through the chamber, amplified by hidden machinery, until it reverberated inside bone. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt," he intoned. The men answered as one. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt." Leonidas did not speak. He felt the words wash over him like cold rain. In Sparta, faith had been strength. Here, faith was surrender. The priest continued. "Cursed is the thought that turns against the emperor's will." "Cursed is the thought that turns against the emperor's will," the soldiers replied. Leonidas felt the tremor that followed, not from the ship, but from within the men themselves. They were afraid of their own minds, afraid of asking why. The ritual lasted longer than any battle had. Words poured forth promising that their lives were not their own, that their deaths were holy, that their suffering was expected and loved by something far away and forever beyond their reach. Candles were lit, extinguished, relit. Names of worlds lost were whispered like the names of saints. When it ended, no one looked relieved. They only looked emptier. Afterward, the scarred soldier led Leonidas down darker corridors, far from the incense and chanting. The air grew colder here, the lights weaker. Pipes wept oily tears. The walls seemed closer. Their metal rippled and warped as if they had once been soft. "You've seen the creed now," the man said. "That's the spine of it." Leonidas looked at him in silence. "We're not taught to hope," the soldier went on. "We're taught to obey, to keep shooting until something ends. Usually us." He stopped before a narrow viewport cut into the hull. Beyond it stretched the void. Not the rich, starlit darkness of myth, but a bruised, shifting abyss, streaked with sickly auroras and distant, impossible storms of color. "This is the warp," the man said quietly. "The thing you came through." Leonidas studied it. He felt it watching him, as it had before. A hungry, fathomless sea of wrongness pressing against fragile reality. He could almost hear the whispers again, just at the edge of thought. "They say the emperor keeps it back," the soldier murmured. "That he sits on a throne of machines and screams into the dark so it doesn't swallow us all." The deck shivered. Leonidas placed a hand against the cold glass. He thought of Olympus, of simple altars, of gods who walked in stories, not in cables and wires. In his world, men feared gods. Here, men feared the silence of one. The first true impact struck the ship then, not the distant thunder of weapons, but a violent, direct blow that threw Leonidas from his feet. Alarms howled, deeper and more frantic. The bulkheads groaned as if they might tear apart at any moment. The scarred soldier grabbed a rail. "Boarding impact," he hissed. From somewhere deep within the ship came a new sound. Claws. Not metal, not machine. Claws scraping against steel. Leonidas pushed himself upright, the bolter still resting heavy against his shoulder. Around him, red lights flared brighter, painting the corridor in the color of fresh slaughter. Faith had not saved them. Prayer had not saved them. Only fire and iron remained. And as the sound of tearing metal drew closer, Leonidas felt the question rise again in his thoughts, darker and sharper than before. What kind of god demands ceaseless war? And what kind of warrior can endure it without becoming a monster? The claws reached the hull before the guns found their targets. Leonidas felt the vibration through the soles of his feet as the metal screamed high and raw, like an animal being torn open while still alive. The corridor lights flickered in violent pulses, bathing everything in stuttering crimson. Somewhere, men shouted orders that overlapped and drowned in shrieking alarms. The stench of incense was swept aside by the sharper, more honest smell of fear. The scarred soldier was already moving. "On the line," he barked, voice hoarse. "Now!" Leonidas followed without hesitation. They formed a defensive arc around a sealed blast door, half melted by burning claws. Behind it, the ship's inner sanctum slept in fragile, trembling silence. Before it, men knelt, braced, weapons raised, breath held inside bellies that had known hunger and despair since birth. Leonidas felt the bolter resting in his hands, like a thing that wanted to be used. He adjusted his stance, instinctively forming a shield wall with men who had never heard of Sparta, yet who understood the shape of survival. The impact came without warning. The door buckled inward with a scream of tortured steel. A slash of raw darkness cut through the metal, wider, wider still, until the wall ahead of them simply ceased to be a wall. Heat poured through the gap, foul and reeking of charred meat and alien musk. The air tasted wrong, thick with chemical filth, and something older, something fouler. The first of them forced its way through. It had once been a man. He could see that. The vague shape of limbs, the remnants of armor twisted and fused into bloated flesh. Its face was a shrine of horror, stretched and split to make room for glistening fangs. Where eyes should have been, there burned a feverish, unnatural red light. "Fire!" someone screamed. The corridor erupted. Bolter shells tore through the air and struck the creature in brutal succession. Its body burst apart in wet detonations, but still it dragged itself forward, howling in something that might once have been speech. The second creature came behind it, then the third, then more, writhing through the breach like maggots from a rotting wound. Leonidas fired. The weapon's roar tore from his hands into the darkness. He did not flinch. He did not blink. Each pull of the trigger was a promise kept. Each explosion in foreign flesh, a silent oath renewed. But these were not Persians. These were not men fighting for land or pride. These were things hollowed out and repurposed by madness. A guardsman to his right screamed as clawed limbs punched through his chest, lifting him from the ground as easily as a child lifting a doll. Another was dragged screaming into the darkness, his voice stretching and snapping like rope. Leonidas stepped forward. He did not know why. He did not consider whether it was wise. He simply moved as he always had when the line faltered. He smashed the bolter's stock into a creature's jaw, felt bone crack and warp beneath the blow. He fired point blank into its skull. The head vanished in a bloom of red and black, and the body collapsed like spoiled meat. Another lunged at him. He caught it. Flesh slick and hot beneath his hands, it writhed and bit, but he drove it backward against the torn metal and pulled the trigger. The bolter thundered. The thing came apart. Men shouted his name, though they did not know it. They shouted wordless sounds of awe and terror as he stood where the breach was widest, where the horror poured through thickest. He became a wall of flesh and iron, unmoving, terrible. In the end, the flow stopped. Silence returned, slow and sickly. The corridor was a ruin of gore and twisted metal. The air steamed with heat. Grease, blood, and ichor ran together across the floor like a blasphemous baptism. The surviving soldiers stood in shaking stillness, smoking barrels lowered, breath shallow and fast. The scarred soldier looked at Leonidas. "You should be dead," he said simply. Leonidas lowered the bolter. His arms trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the fading surge of war that had carried him through the madness. His body remembered spear and shield, not thunder and fire, but it had adapted. It always did. Later they cleaned the corridor in silence. In this place, there were no songs for the fallen. Their bodies were stacked, tagged, and taken away by robed figures who whispered prayers without stopping. Leonidas stood alone for a moment, staring at the blackened breach. The warp's presence still lingered there, a faint whisper, like fingers brushing at the edge of the mind. He could almost hear the voices again, promising, mocking, laughing. A hand touched his shoulder. The scarred soldier stood beside him. "You did well," he said. "Most men don't last their first real breach." Leonidas looked at the darkness. In Thermopylae, he had known why he fought. Here, he had only known how. As the ship groaned and slowly sealed its wounds, as alarms faded into exhausted silence, a terrible understanding slid deeper into his thoughts. The Imperium did not fight to win. It fought to endure. And as long as it endured, men like him would be asked to bleed, to burn, and to stand. The thought did not frighten him, but the question that rose behind it did. If this was only the beginning, how much of himself would he have to lose before the war finally swallowed him whole? The calm that followed the breach was not peace. It was the breath drawn by a wounded beast before it lunged again. Leonidas felt it in the deck beneath his feet, in the faint tremor that never truly left the metal bones of the ship. Men moved through the corridors with a slower gait now, shoulders hunched, as if the walls themselves were listening. No one laughed. No one boasted. Those who survived did not pretend they were safe. The scarred soldier walked beside him as they were summoned forward, deeper into the vessel, toward a region marked by heavier doors and silent red icons shaped like stylized skulls. "They've answered the distress call," the man said quietly. Leonidas did not ask who. He felt them before he saw them. A pressure in the air, a tightening of the skin, the scent of burned ozone and sacred oil so thick it tasted like lightning on the tongue. The corridor widened into a vast hangar where the ceiling ascended beyond vision, lost in shadow and hanging cable chains. Gunships rested upon the deck like predatory birds, their hulls scarred and blackened. Servitors crawled over them, welding, blessing, binding shards of purity seals into the metal with hands that ended in tools and blades. The men of the guard formed rigid ranks without being told. Leonidas stood among them. Then the air changed. The sound came first, a heavy, rhythmic tread, each step an impact, each impact a declaration of something that did not fear death, did not fear darkness, did not fear anything that breathed. The sound of ceramite boots striking steel was not hurried. It was inevitable. They emerged from the shadows, giants. No other word would take shape in Leonidas's mind. They were men, but only in the distant way a mountain might be called a stone. Their armor was a deep, solemn blue, etched with gold script and battle honors. Their helms were shaped like skulls crowned by iron halos. Their eyes burned behind red lenses that never blinked. Each carried a weapon that made the bolter in Leonidas's hands feel like a child's tool. The guardsmen lowered their heads in unison. "Angels of death," the scarred soldier whispered. Leonidas did not bow. He studied them as he would study rival kings. One of them stepped forward. His presence bent the space around him, not physically, but in a way that caused men to shift their feet and swallow their words. The aquila upon his chestplate was larger, heavier, burnished like a sun that had never known warmth. "You held," the giant said, his voice a low thunder that rolled through bone. "That is sufficient." The words were not praise. They were judgment. Leonidas felt the ancient pride stir within him, unbidden. In another life, he might have answered, might have spoken of shields held and spears broken, of how men should fight and die with open eyes. Here, he remained silent. The Astartes turned, already uninterested, and walked toward the waiting gunships. They did not look at the dead. They did not offer words to the wounded. They did not thank the living. They were not there to comfort. They were there to end things. Leonidas watched as they boarded their craft, hatches sealing with the sound of finality. Engines roared to life, screaming through the hangar like chained storms. Heat blasted across the deck, stirring ash and parchment and the ashes of the unspoken prayers of 1,000 broken men. The gunships lifted, vanishing into the dark throat of the ship's launch bays. Silence followed them, a silence that felt heavier than battle. "They're not like us," the scarred soldier said, quiet again. "They're what we pray for when things have gone too far wrong." Leonidas looked at the empty space they had occupied. He thought of the phalanx at Thermopylae, of shoulder pressed to shoulder, of men who felt the same fear and the same fury. These giants did not fear. They did not doubt. They did not bleed as men did. He wondered what had been done to them to make them such things. The deck beneath their feet quivered again, but this time the tremor was not hostile. It was purposeful. A message came through the Vox systems, rough and distorted. Coordinates, orders. The sound of a far-off world being named, syllables thick with static and doom. A deployment. The guardsmen began to move again, shaking off stillness like rusted chains torn from their limbs. Weapons were checked, armor sealed, prayers muttered through clenched teeth. The scarred soldier adjusted his helmet and looked at Leonidas. "You'll see them again," he said, meaning the giants. "Planetside, when things get worse." Leonidas nodded once. He felt no fear at the thought, only a growing weight. The hangar doors groaned open, revealing a churning tunnel of void beyond. Cold starlight spilled across the deck, pale and pitiless. Somewhere out there, a world waited, already screaming in silence. As they prepared to board their own transport, Leonidas felt a strange duality settle within him. Among the guard, he was strong. Among the Astartes, he was nothing. And as the engines began to howl and the floor trembled underfoot, a single thought rose, dark and sharp, threading itself through the fire of his heart. If even gods of war walked this galaxy, what then was he becoming? The planet below them did not look like a world. It looked like a wound. From the narrow viewport of the transport, Leonidas watched as clouds the color of old bruises twisted across a surface lit by distant fires. Cities sprawled beneath that sky, but they were not cities of light or order. They were jagged silhouettes of towers and broken spires, connected by threads of smoke and ash. Storms of embers rolled across the horizon like slow, burning waves. The transport shook as it descended. Guardsmen sat in silence along the walls, weapons resting across armored knees, heads bowed not in prayer but exhaustion. Some mumbled words under their breath. Some stared into nothing. A few clutched small tokens, bits of bone, tarnished coins, scraps of parchment with prayers scratched in cramped, trembling script. Leonidas sat among them, listening to the growl of the engines. His reflection stared back from the dull metal of the wall, older, heavier, shadowed. He scarcely recognized the man who had stood at Thermopylae. That man had known death was coming. This man knew death was constant. The transport lurched violently. A red light bathed the crew bay. A metallic voice crackled overhead, emotionless and inevitable. Atmospheric contact in 30 heartbeats. Leonidas closed his eyes. Behind them rose the ghosts. Bronze shields locked in place, spears raised to a crimson sky. The ring of Spartans, shoulder to shoulder, bloodied but unbroken. He smelled dust and sweat instead of oil and incense. He heard the voices of men who had known his name, who had known laughter, who had believed their deaths would echo into legend. Here, death did not echo. It vanished. The transport slammed down. The rear ramp dropped with a hiss of escaping steam and hydraulic screams. Heat poured in, thick and choked with ash. The air tasted like scorched stone and rot. Wind howled through skeletal structures, carrying distant cries that might have been men, or might have been something else. "Move," someone shouted. They disembarked into a street that had once been a boulevard. Now it was a canyon of broken statues and shattered vehicles. Cathedral-sized ruins loomed overhead, their stained glass blown out, their carved saints decapitated and defaced. The sky roared. Something huge moved through the clouds, a shadow shaped like hunger. Leonidas fell into formation without being ordered. He placed himself at the forward edge, instincts older than empire guiding him. The men did not object. They shifted around him. The scarred soldier moved to his side. "You'll be thinking of old wars," the man said, without looking at him. "First Planet does that." Leonidas said nothing. They advanced through drifting ash. The world groaned around them. Underfoot, the ground was warm, cracked as if the earth itself had been flayed and left to heal badly. Every footstep echoed, too loud, carrying too far. The first shots came from nowhere. Red beams sliced the air, burning through armor and flesh alike. Guardsmen fell, some silent, some screaming. Bolters roared in reply, thunder trapped in steel. But the enemy was hidden, folded into the ruins. Leonidas dropped to one knee, sighting down, the weapon he had learned to wield through battle after battle. He fired toward the flicker of movement behind a shattered arch. The explosion of impact showered dust and fragments across the street. A shape fell, twitching and burning. There was no satisfaction, only rhythm. Push forward, hold line, kill what comes. The ghosts of Sparta pressed closer to him with every step. He saw their faces in the visors of the men around him. He heard their voices in the distant thunder. He smelled their sweat in the smoke. A shell detonated nearby. The blast threw him into a broken wall. Stone crumbled under his weight. For a moment, the world narrowed again to ringing ears, and breath dragged through burned lungs. He struggled to stand. In the choking dust, he saw men retreating. Not in disarray, not in panic, but in measured, broken steps. Falling back because the line had thinned too far. Sparta had never taught retreat. Sparta had taught standing. Leonidas stepped forward anyway. "Hold," he said, though none around him understood the word. But they understood the motion. He planted himself in the broken street, weapon raised, body squared, feet wide. One by one, men stopped retreating. They turned back. They formed behind him, instinct recognizing instinct. The enemy surged from the ruins, shapes twisted by augmetics and hatred, faces hidden behind scavenged masks, bodies wrapped in stolen armor. Heretics, rebels, men who had turned their backs on the Imperium and embraced something worse. They howled as they charged. Leonidas fired until his weapon burned in his hands. Bolters roared in unison around him. The street became a killing ground. When it was over, the air was thick with drifting ash and falling flakes of burned parchment torn from ruined banners. Corpses lay twisted among rubble, indistinguishable in death. The scarred soldier approached, voice rough. "You shouldn't have held." Leonidas looked at the dead. He thought of the pass. He thought of the sea of Persian spears. He thought of brothers who had died knowing why. Here, no one knew why. The retreat resumed, slower now, steadier. They fell back to a fortified line near a collapsed basilica carved with skulls and iron saints. Artillery thundered somewhere beyond sight. The world burned in every direction. Leonidas leaned against broken stone, breath slow, heavy. The ghosts of Sparta did not fade. They stood closer now, their eyes no longer proud, but questioning. Was this what his legacy had been meant for? Was this endless, filthy war the fate of all warriors, no matter their origin? As a distant explosion tore the horizon open in a blossom of fire, a thought pierced him more sharply than shrapnel. If even his brothers would not recognize this battlefield, what then of the man he was becoming here? The cathedral world did not fall in a scream. It fell in a prayer. Leonidas first understood this as the fortress basilica rose before them, its broken towers clawing at a sky, choked with smoke. Once, it had been a monument to faith so vast that it had devoured a mountain to be born. Now, It stood like a cracked tooth in the jaw of a dying world, its great doors hanging open, its stained glass blasted into glittering shards across the ground. This was the line. The guard had been driven back street by street, shrine by shrine, and now there was nowhere left to retreat. Behind the basilica lay only a steep drop into a chasm that had once been a holy valley, now filled with flames and writhing fog. If this place fell, nothing remained. Artillery echoed like distant thunder as they took positions among broken statues of winged saints. Their faces had been shattered by cannon fire, leaving only empty, accusing eyes staring toward the heavens. Heavy bolters were mounted between fallen pillars. Sandbags were piled before cracked altars. Leonidas stood at the center of the line. No one questioned it. The scarred soldier knelt beside him, adjusting the feed of a weapon that was nearly as large as his torso. "They'll come through the main avenue," he said. "They like symbols." Leonidas looked down the long, ruined road that led toward the city's heart. Ash drifted through the air like black snow. The silence was too complete. Then came the drums. Not instruments. The impact of armored feet. The sound of chains dragged across stone. The low, animal chanting of men who had torn their souls apart and found something else waiting in the hollow. They came in waves. Not an army, but a tide. Heretics clad in patchwork armor, their flesh carved with jagged sigils that wept pus and blood. Some carried stolen lasrafals. Others bore cleavers made from bone and rusted ship plating. And among them walked larger shapes, twisted and swollen, their bodies warped by worship of things that should not be named. "Hold!" The vox crackled uselessly through static. Leonidas did not wait for the order. He raised his bolter. Fire blossomed across the line. The avenue transformed into a storm of detonations. Bodies burst apart under explosive shells. Stonework crumbled as bolts struck the old imperial masonry. Smoke poured back toward them, as though the very air was trying to escape what was coming. The heretics did not slow. They screamed praises to false gods. They walked through fire. They clawed over their own dead. A heavy impact rocked the line as something massive crashed against the central barricade. The metal supports bent inward. Hands like claws reached through, grabbing, tearing, pulling men forward into the press of monsters beyond. Leonidas moved. He leapt from cover, landing in the open avenue amid falling ash and burning limbs. The air howled around him. He felt the heat scorch his skin through tattered armor. The heretics saw him. For a heartbeat, they hesitated, not in fear, in recognition. Something ancient in them understood that this was not just another guardsman. He fired into them until the bolter burned his at palms raw. When the magazine ran dry, he did not retreat. He took a fallen man's blade. It was crude, ugly, a poor thing compared to the weapons of Sparta. And yet, in his hands, it became an answer. He waded forward, cutting and smashing, driving into their midst. Blood coated him. Ash blinded him. Screams filled the air until they no longer sounded like voices. Behind him, the guard rallied. Men who had moments before been on the verge of breaking found their feet again. They surged forward, drawn by instinct, by stubbornness, by the simple refusal to let something worse cross that threshold. The line became a wall. The wall became a storm. By the time the sunless sky darkened further, and the heretics finally faltered, the avenue had become a carpet of butchered forms and burning debris. Silence crept back, broken only by the crackle of distant fires. Leonidas stood among the dead. His chest rose and fell slowly. The scarred soldier approached, staring at him as if seeing something no longer entirely human. They'll tell stories about this line, the man said. They'll lie in them, but they'll remember the shape of it. Leonidas looked back toward the basilica. In its broken doorway, men wept silently. Others leaned their heads against stone blackened by old faith and new blood. Some whispered the emperor's name with shaking voices. They had not won. They had endured. A flare shot into the poisoned sky, marking their position. Somewhere far above, in cold, star-choked orbit, ships would see it and mark them down as still alive, still useful, still capable of dying another day. Leonidas sheathed the crude blade and raised his bolter once more, stepping back into position as dusk, artificial, choking, permanent, settled over the ruins. From beyond the avenue came fresh sounds, new movement, new chanting, new drums, a second wave, a larger one. And as he tightened his grip and felt the familiar fire coil in his chest again, a single, dreadful realization settled over him with calm, iron certainty. This world would never be saved. It would only be fought over, corpse by corpse, prayer by prayer, until nothing remained but ash and memory. And he wondered, for the first time, whether even a king of Sparta could hold back an ocean that had no shore. Night had no meaning on a world that burned without cease. Yet a deeper darkness settled over the broken basilica as the second wave gathered beyond sight. The air grew thicker, sluggish, as though reality itself had become reluctant to hold together. Leonidas felt it long before he understood it, a pressure behind the eyes, a coldness crawling along the spine, a wrongness that did not come from blade or fire. The heretics did not charge at once. They waited. From the ruined avenue came low chanting, no longer frenzied, no longer animal. It was measured now, deliberate. Words stretched and bent in the air, older than language, older than thought. The stones beneath their feet trembled, and hairline fractures began to spiderweb through the cracked ground. The guard tightened their formation. No one spoke. Even the scarred soldier was silent, his jaw set, his gaze fixed upon the drifting ash, as if listening to a threat he could not yet hear. Leonidas felt the whispers. They did not arrive through sound. They arrived through memory. He saw Sparta again, but it was wrong. The sky above was too dark, streaked with impossible colors. The shields of his brothers were etched with sigils that shimmered and moved. Their eyes were not proud now, but hollow and burning with a feverish light. A voice coiled through his thoughts. You do not belong among them. He did not answer. You do not belong to a corpse god who cannot speak. The ground shuddered as a deep fracture split the avenue, vomiting foul, violet light into the air. Shapes moved within that light, half seen, half imagined. Men began to whisper prayers in breaking voices. Leonidas clenched his fists. I know your name, the voice said. I know the taste of your rage. I know the weight of your loneliness. It was not loud. It was intimate. The chanting from the heretics rose in volume. The air warped, bending the light from distant fires until the world looked like a reflection seen through broken glass. Leonidas felt a presence behind him, not physical. Worse. It brushed against his thoughts like cold fingers sliding across an old scar. Visions poured in without permission. Countless worlds in flame. Cities falling like rotten fruit into warp-fueled abyss. Thrones made of bone and crowns of screaming faces. A galaxy that did not pretend to care about honor or sacrifice or kings. A galaxy honest in its hatred. You could be more, it whispered. Not a wall, not a sacrifice, not a forgotten relic in a rotting empire. He tasted blood. He had bitten through his own lip. Around him, men began to falter. One dropped to his knees, clutching his helmet, whispering incoherent prayers. Another fired blindly down the avenue, shots exploding uselessly against stone. The scarred soldier grabbed a trembling guardsman and shook him. "Hold your mind," he hissed. "Hold it or it will take you." Leonidas closed his eyes. In darkness, he saw Thermopylae as it had been. Not beautiful, not poetic. Broken men standing in defiance of inevitability. He remembered the fear, the certainty of death, the calm that followed acceptance. The whispers continued, oily and patient. "You have seen how small they are, how fragile, how easily they break. Come away from them. You are not meant to die screaming for a throne that does not know your name." The ground split wider. From the crack emerged something that did not walk, but unfolded. A shape made of shadows and half-formed limbs. Its surface writhed with faces that were not faces. Mouths opening and closing as if tasting the air. The guardsman froze. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare galaxy, Leonidas felt a moment of true stillness within himself. Not fear, not rage, clarity. He stepped forward. The creature turned toward him, its countless eyes blinking, its form swelling taller, wider, as if recognizing something it had hoped to find. "Yes," it whispered. "You hear us." Leonidas raised his weapon. He did not fire. He spoke instead, though the creature did not understand the tongue. "I stood and died once," he said quietly. "I will stand again." The whisper hissed, retreating from the shape of the thought itself. "That is not your fate," it purred. "You can be more than memory." The heretics charged. They burst from the ruins as the warp light surged higher, their faces twisted in fanatical ecstasy. Bolter fire roared as the guard responded, panic and discipline colliding in uneven bursts of thunder. Leonidas fired. Each shot tore through flesh and belief alike. He did not let the whispers pull at him again. He did not let the visions linger. He anchored himself in the physical world. Recoil, heat, the smell of propellant and blood. The shadow thing recoiled as shells struck the ground around it. It did not die. It folded back into the fracture, parts of it dissolving like smoke in strong wind. The crack in the earth sealed slowly, reluctantly, leaving only scorched stone and drifting toxic fog. The heretics broke against the line. They died screaming. When it was over, the world felt oddly small. Men sat down where they stood, shaking, weeping, laughing without humor. The scarred soldier looked at Leonidas as if he had seen a ghost fight a god. "It spoke to us," he murmured. "I heard it. Everyone did." Leonidas lowered his weapon. The whisper lingered faintly, like a dying echo inside his mind. He looked toward the cracks in the stone, now cooling, now silent. The warp had noticed him, marked him, and as distant thunder rolled across a burning horizon, a dangerous question took root where once there had only been defiance. If the darkness offered truth, and the Imperium offered only endless death, how long could he cling to a path that led nowhere but extinction? The aftermath of the warp's touch lingered like a sickness. The air around the broken basilica felt thin, stretched, bruised by something that had pressed too hard against reality and only just retreated. Men moved carefully, as if loud sounds might reopen the wound in the world. No one spoke of the whispers. No one named the shadow that had crawled from the earth. Naming it would make it real again. Leonidas remained standing while others rested. He felt eyes on him, not curious, wary. Bootsteps approached from behind, measured and certain. He did not turn at once. He could feel the presence in the way one feels a drawn blade behind the neck. You stood in front of it. The voice was cold, perfectly controlled. Leonidas turned. The man in the black coat stood there, his peaked cap casting his face in shadow. The blade at his side hummed faintly, alive with caged lightning. His eyes assessed, measured, dissected. "It spoke," the man went on. "That makes you a risk." Leonidas did not deny it. Around them, the survivors worked in silence. They cleaned weapons. They stacked the dead. They traced the aquila over their chests. No one drew close. The man gestured toward a section of the basilica that still stood. "Walk." Leonidas obeyed. They passed through shattered archways and into a side chapel that had somehow avoided total ruin. The roof was cracked but intact. Candles burned in shallow niches, their flames trembling but stubborn. A broken statue of a saint lay on its side, its wings snapped, its eyes gouged out. The black-coated man closed the door behind them. Silence fell heavy. "You are not of this age," he said. "You are not of this war. You should not exist." Leonidas met his gaze without wavering. "Men who hear the warp's voice rarely walk away unmarked," the man continued. "Some become prophets. Some become madmen. Some become weapons for things that should never be named." He stepped closer. "I must decide which you are." Leonidas felt something unfamiliar coil inside his chest. Not fear, defiance. In Sparta, a king answered only to the gods. Here, he stood before a man. The flames of the candles flickered violently as a distant impact rolled through the ground, but the black-coated figure did not glance away. "There were men," he said, "who panicked when the whispering began. I watched them. I watched their eyes. I ended 3 of them myself." He let that truth sit between them. "I did not end you." Leonidas gave a slow nod. "You stepped forward," the man went on. "You did not flee. You did not kneel. You did not beg." He studied him, as if searching for cracks in stone. "Why?" Leonidas spoke, though the words were foreign to the man's ear. "Because the line was breaking." The meaning passed between them nonetheless. The black-coated man considered him in silence. "There is another truth you must understand," he said, quieter now. "The Imperium does not love you. It does not care what you were. It will spend you. It will burn you out like a match struck against the night." He leaned in close. "And I will be the one to light that match if you ever falter." Leonidas did not look away. The moment between them thickened, drawn tight like a rope about to snap. Then the man stepped back. "For now," he said, "you live." He reached into his coat and produced a small metal token. It bore the double-headed aquila, worn smooth by countless hands. "This marks you under my observation," he said, pressing it into Leonidas's palm. "It also marks you as someone I expect not to disappoint me." The weight of it was heavy, not in mass, but in meaning. Outside, the thunder of artillery grew louder. Reports began to echo through the basilica. Vox chatter filtered in through broken speakers. The heretics were regrouping. Something larger had been sighted, moving through the ruins beyond the main avenue. New orders were coming, new lines being drawn. The black-coated man turned toward the door. "One more thing," he said, without looking back. "Mercy is a weakness. Doubt is treason. Curiosity is a doorway for damnation." He paused. "You walked close to that doorway today." Then he was gone, boots fading into the rhythm of war. Leonidas stood alone in the small chapel. He looked at the token in his hand, at the light of the candles trembling across its surface. In his homeland, kings carried crowns. In this place, warriors carried warnings. He stepped back into the larger ruin. Men looked at him differently now, not like a curiosity, like a liability, like a hope they were afraid to name. The scarred soldier caught his eye from across the chamber. He said nothing, but there was a question in his gaze. Leonidas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He would stand. He would fight. He would not fall to whispers. But as distant, closer explosions began to shake the very bones of the world, and the call to move positions echoed through the broken basilica, a colder thought settled into his mind, heavy as iron. How long before the man in the black coat decided that survival itself was proof of corruption, and that Leonidas of Sparta had become something that must be executed rather than trusted? The token felt heavier with every step, not because of its metal, but because of what it represented. Leonidas could feel the eyes of men upon him as he returned to the line. They did not whisper. They did not point. Soldiers of the guard had learned long ago that spoken thoughts had a way of returning in the form of a commissar's bullet. The next assault did not break upon them like a wave. It ground against them. Hours passed in a haze of smoke, recoil, screaming metal, and prayers forced through clenched teeth. The sky remained a roiling bruise above the basilica, never brightening, never darkening properly, locked in a perpetual twilight of ash. Leonidas moved along the line without being ordered. He did not shout commands. He did not make speeches. He simply placed himself where the fighting was heaviest. Men followed. They pretended it was coincidence. But the pattern took shape. Where he stood, the line did not fold as quickly. Where he fought, men remembered their training. Where he moved, the panic lessened, if only by the width of a breath. The scarred soldier watched it happen without comment. "There are names for things like this," he muttered once, while feeding fresh ammunition into a snarling heavy bolter. "They don't say them out loud." Leonidas did not answer. The heretics surged again, this time with beasts in their midst, things stitched from flesh and machine, bellowing prayers to gods made of hunger. Stub rounds and lasfare barely slowed them. Bolters blew away chunks of corruption, but still they crawled forward. Leonidas climbed the broken remains of a saint's statue. From its crumbled chest, he looked down upon the battlefield, not as a man caught in a storm, but as a figure standing atop a wall, seeing where the pressure fell hardest. He pointed. The men understood. A shift of fire drowned one flank in detonations. A heavy weapon was dragged into position just in time to cut down a charging abomination. A wounded guardsman was pulled back before claws could find him. He was not trained in their tactics. He did not know their codes. And yet, war spoke a language older than empire. The battle dragged on until the ruins glowed with heat. By the time the enemy fell back, the guard did not cheer. They simply breathed. In the aftermath, men gathered around a broken standard pole that had once borne the imperial aquila. The metal bird had been blasted from it, leaving only a jagged stump at the top. A young soldier stood there, hands trembling, holding a length of torn cloth. On it, someone had painted a crude image in fuel black and blood, a circle of shields, a lone figure standing before a storm. The shape was unmistakable, even if the name was not. The scarred soldier glanced at Leonidas. "They did that," he said. Leonidas looked away. He had not asked for it. He had not commanded it. The banner was tied to the broken pole and raised. It did not replace the aquila. It rose beside it, a defiance that avoided treason by the breadth of a thought. The men gathered beneath it, not in worship, in quiet, exhausted solidarity. The shift in morale was subtle, but real. Handshakes lasted a second longer. Helmets were touched against shoulders. Water was shared without prompting. The commissar observed from a distance. Leonidas felt his gaze like frost against the back of his neck. Night inched closer, though the sky never changed. A fresh barrage of artillery roared over them, slamming into distant ruins. Reports came through broken Vox channels of new threats stirring beyond the city's edge. The war was far from over. The scarred soldier stood beside Leonidas as they watched the banner snapping weakly in the ash-choked wind. "They'll call it mutiny if it grows," he said quietly. Leonidas nodded. He thought of Sparta. He thought of shields painted with emblems that meant brotherhood. He thought of how fragile this kind of hope was. A voice crackled over the comm lines. Armored movement reported. Not heretics, not beasts, something else. The name passed through static, barely intelligible, yet heavy with dread. Traitor Astartes. Leonidas felt the tension ripple through the men like a living thing. Fingers tightened on grips. Prayers turned sharper, more desperate. The scarred soldier looked at him. "This is where legends break," he said. Leonidas looked at the banner, at the men behind it, at the long night pressing in. He felt the weight of the token in his armor. He felt the whispers still faintly curled in his thoughts. And yet, he stepped forward to the front of the line. If this was to be the breaking point, then he would be there to witness it. As distant, thunderous footsteps began to echo through the ruins, and the air itself seemed to recoil in fear, a thought colder than any blast of warp wind took hold within him. Had he just inspired something that would be remembered? Or had he lit a flame that would bring the commissar's blade down upon every man who dared to stand beside him? The ground itself felt bruised as the traitors approached. Leonidas sensed it through the stone, through the fractured earth, through the bones of the shattered basilica that protested under a new, heavier rhythm. This was not the scrambling charge of heretics, not the mindless rush of warp-spawn beasts. This was deliberate, measured, predatory. The first shape emerged from the drifting ash like a nightmare given iron form. A figure taller than any man, wrapped in twisted ceramite that had once been loyal blue and now wore the broken colors of betrayal. Its helm was crowned with jagged horns, its lenses burning with a dim, hateful red. Behind it, more shapes moved. Traitor Astartes. The men around Leonidas did not need to be told. They felt the difference. Bolters along the line lifted as one. Breathing slowed, teeth clenched, sweating palms tightened their grip on weapons that suddenly felt too small. The traitors advanced without haste. Their steps were thunderous, each footfall striking the ruined street like a gavel delivering judgment. They did not raise their weapons at once. They did not rush. They simply walked, letting their presence crush the air. The scarred soldier leaned close. "We don't win this," he whispered. "We only decide how long it costs them." Leonidas nodded. He understood that kind of battle instinctively. Bolter fire erupted. Shells streaked through smoke and ash, detonating against traitor armor in violent flashes. The impacts sent sparks and fragments flying, but the giants barely slowed. Some stumbled. Some turned their helms slightly toward the source. None fell. Their return fire was not thunder. It was annihilation. Heavy shells screamed into the guards' lines, tearing men apart in bursts of wet, brutal light. Bodies vanished. Stone exploded. The world shook with every impact. Leonidas moved before he thought. He pushed forward through falling debris, through screaming men, toward a broken stretch of roadway where a heavy support weapon lay abandoned beside a dead crew. He seized it, hefting the weight with a grunt as the barrels bit into the hot air. He fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulders like a siege ram. The round struck a traitor square in the chest. Explosions blossomed across corrupted ceramite. The giant staggered. It did not stop. It charged. Time narrowed. The roaring of the world faded. Leonidas stepped back, then forward, positioning himself between the advancing Astartes and the banner snapping weakly behind him. He abandoned the heavy weapon, drawing the crude blade he had carried since the siege began. The traitor loomed above him. Its voice was a grinding rasp through a vox-distorted grill. "You are nothing." Leonidas met its gaze. "I am still standing." The giant swung. Leonidas ducked beneath the blow, the air screaming where the massive weapon passed. He drove the blade into a joint where armor split slightly at the neck. It did not pierce fully, but it did something more important. It surprised. The traitor staggered. The men opened fire. This time fate shifted. Concentrated blast tore into the weakened point. The giant fell to one knee. Leonidas surged forward and jammed a grenade beneath the cracked plating. He did not step back. The explosion consumed the traitor, tearing it apart in a blossom of fire and shrapnel. Leonidas was thrown from his feet, stone and metal tearing across his battered armor. He hit the ground hard. For a heartbeat, he did not rise. The world rang. The sky spun. He tasted ash, blood, and something older. When he forced himself upright, the battle still raged. Other traitors moved through the street, cutting through guardsmen with contemptuous ease. The banner behind him was riddled with holes, but it still hung, tattered and defiant. Leonidas staggered to his feet. He caught sight of another shape moving through smoke. Not like the others, larger, more brutal, a war leader. Its armor was a patchwork of conquered enemies, skulls chained across its chest, horns rising like a crown. Its weapon was a massive, crackling axe that seemed to tear the air itself. It looked at him. Of all the battlefield, its attention turned to him. The war leader began to walk forward. Not run, not charge. Walk. Leonidas felt the line behind him tightening. Men ready to fire, to die, to hold. He raised his weapon again. Then the sky split open. No thunder, no lightning, just fire. A lance of burning light came down from the heavens, hammering into the street between them. The ground detonated. The shockwave flattened debris, bodies, and burning air outward in a ring of devastation. Orbital fire. The traitor war leader staggered. Leonidas was thrown back once more, slammed against cracked stone. When the smoke cleared, the street was a crater of molten ruin. The war leader was still standing, armor blackened, flesh burning, eyes burning brighter. It stepped forward from the inferno. Leonidas climbed to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. The men behind him shifted, unsure. He stepped forward instead. If this world was truly dead, if this war had no end, then this was where he would stand. The traitor war leader raised its axe. The surviving guardsmen leveled their weapons. The banner snapped behind him like a wounded thing refusing to fall. And as the sky above them burned and the smell of melted stone filled the air, Leonidas felt the last, terrible question take hold of him, cold and inevitable. Was this the moment he became a legend, or the moment the galaxy finally ground him into dust as it had all the rest? The axe fell like the judgment of a broken god. Leonidas moved as he had always moved, forward, not back. The blade bit through the air where his head had been a heartbeat before, smashing stone where he had stood. Fragments of masonry screamed past him as he drove himself close, inside the arc of the weapon. The traitor war leader was not slow. It was ancient in its wrath. A mailed fist hammered into Leonidas's chest, hurling him across the street and into the ribs of a shattered statue. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent white fire lancing through his bones. He did not stay down. The guardsmen opened fire. They did not hesitate. Not now. Not when something stood between their fragile line and the slow extinction of everything behind them. Bolter shells detonated against the war leader's back, but it barely acknowledged them. It turned instead, observing the line with something that might have been amusement. Leonidas pushed himself up. His hands were slick with his own blood. He tasted iron. The war leader turned back to him. "You inspire them," it growled, Vox distortion twisting its voice into a chorus of wrongness. "That is a crime." Leonidas said nothing. He attacked. He drove forward with a broken roar torn from his chest, slashing upward, striking again at the weak point he had found before. The blade scraped uselessly across corrupted ceramite, throwing sparks, doing little more than angering the monster that towered above him. The war leader seized him by the throat. Leonidas felt fingers close like iron clamps. He was lifted from the ground. The world shrank to blur and fire. Behind him, men screamed. Orders were shouted. Someone called his name, though they did not know it. The war leader's face was close now, helm lenses burning into his eyes. "You could have been one of us," it hissed. "You stand in the wrong age, for the wrong corpse, for a lie that never loved you." For a heartbeat, the whispers of the warp stirred again. "Come, be more, be free." Leonidas did not close his eyes. He remembered the hot dust of Thermopylae. He remembered the press of shields. He remembered men who had laughed with him, bled with him, died knowing their king did not kneel. He drove his knee into the war leader's abdomen. Once. Twice. The third blow was answered by a crushing throw that smashed him into the street like discarded refuse. The blade slipped from his numb fingers. The war leader stepped forward. It raised its axe. Bolter fire struck it point blank from the flank. The scarred soldier stood there, face grim, weapon shaking in his hands as he emptied round after round into the traitor's helm. The impacts forced its head to snap back, cracking lenses, tearing away horned plating. The axe faltered, just for a moment. It was enough. Leonidas rolled to the fallen blade and seized it once more. He rose, legs unsteady, and surged forward. He drove the weapon into the exposed weakness at the traitor's neck. This time, it bit deep. The blade sank into corrupted flesh, and black, burning ichor spilled out, hissing as it touched the air. The war leader roared, a sound that was equal parts rage and disbelief. Leonidas wrenched the blade sideways. The war leader collapsed to one knee. The guard did not hesitate. They drowned it in fire. Shell after shell tore it apart from within. The axe fell from its hands. The massive frame staggered, twitched, and finally toppled, crashing into the molten crater left by orbital fire. Silence fell in fractured pieces. The sky burned. The street steamed. Leonidas stood over the corpse of the war leader, chest heaving, vision darkening at the edges. Men stared at him, not with awe, with fear. He saw it now, the shape of it, the danger. He was becoming something that did not fit within the narrow, suffocating shape of the Imperium. Hope was not safe here. Inspiration was not safe. Legends were not safe. The commissar watched from the far ruins. Their eyes met across ash and smoke. No nod, no approval, only calculation. The guardsmen gathered around Leonidas without thinking, forming a loose, instinctive perimeter. They did not speak. They did not cheer. They simply stood nearer to him than before. That was enough. The Vox crackled to life. Voices came through sharp with urgency. New orders, a withdrawal, a redeployment. The city's outer districts had fallen. This world was being slowly written off, like so many others. Expendable. Leonidas watched as servitors moved among the dead, collecting gene seed from fallen loyal Astartes, ignoring guardsmen corpses entirely. Even in death, there were hierarchies. The scarred soldier approached him. "You shouldn't have lived," he said quietly. "That thing kills men like us for sport." Leonidas looked at his hands. They trembled now, not from fear, from understanding. "What happens now?" the soldier asked. Leonidas looked toward the burning horizons, toward the endless war, toward a galaxy that did not allow men like him to exist gently. He knew the answer without knowing the words. Now he would be watched. Now he would be weighed. Now every step he took would be judged not only by his enemies, but by those he fought beside. As transports began to descend in roaring lines of fire and steel to evacuate what remained of the guard, Leonidas felt the weight of what he had done settle on his shoulders like a new kind of armor. He had not just survived, he had inspired, and in the Imperium of Man, that was often considered more dangerous than heresy. As the thunder of engines drowned the sounds of burning ruins, a darker question than any battlefield, fear whispered through his mind. Had he earned their hope, or had he just signed the death warrant of everyone who dared to believe in him? The evacuation was not a retreat. It was a funeral procession. Transports howled overhead, their engines screaming through poisoned skies as cables and gunfire stitched the air. Ramps slammed down against shattered stone, and soldiers were herded forward with the urgency of men who knew that hesitation meant extinction. The city behind them burned without ceremony. The line had not moved forward. It had simply stopped dying all at once. Leonidas climbed the ramp of a transport and felt the deck vibrate beneath his feet, like a living thing desperate to escape the ground. Men packed tight around him, shoulders pressed together, weapons held loosely now, as if their arms had forgotten how to relax. The scarred soldier sat opposite him, breathing heavily, helmet cradled in his hands. "We're not being redeployed," he said. "We're being thrown." Leonidas understood. The ramp slammed shut. The engines roared louder, and gravity shifted violently as the transport lifted away from the dead world. Through a narrow viewport, he watched the burning ruin recede, swallowed by smoke and cloud. There was no relief in leaving it, only a deeper dread of what awaited. The next world was not called by name. It was called a line, a place of last defense, a point on a map where fleets had failed, where Astartes had bought time with their gene seed and their bones, where only the Imperial Guard remained. When the transport punched through the clouds, Leonidas saw it. A fortress world. Once. Now it was a ring of fire around a colossal cathedral bastion. The land was carved into mud and craters, twisted remnants of defensive lines still visible like scars that never healed. Above it all sailed broken ships, some falling, some burning, some already dead. They landed under fire. Shells burst around the transport as it slammed into the broken earth. The ramp dropped before the engines had fully died. Men poured out, moving forward without commands, guided by the instinct that had replaced hope long ago. Leonidas stepped into hell. The sky was a tapestry of explosions. Thunderhawks burned as they fell. Wreckage screamed through the air. The fortress cathedral ahead still stood, its stained glass blazing with internal fire, its spires defiant amid devastation. This was the final line. There was no step behind it. The commissar stood waiting. His coat snapped in the hot, violent wind. His blade hummed faintly at his side. Around him gathered officers, veterans, remnants of units stitched together by panic and paperwork. He looked at Leonidas, and nodded. Not approval, acknowledgement. "You hold here," he said simply. Leonidas nodded in return. They formed the line as the first wave came. Not heretics, not traitor Astartes. Something older. Xenos. A tide of chitin and teeth that surged across no man's land in a writhing carpet of hunger. Their shrieks cut through gunfire like knives through exposed nerve. Their bodies deflected light, curved like living armor, countless limbs carrying them forward without slowing. Lasfire stitched the air. Heavy bolters thundered. Artillery rained from the fortress walls. They kept coming. Leonidas stood at the center. He felt no more whispers, no more doubt. Only the calm of a man standing where he had always belonged. Creatures reached the barricade. Claws tore into sandbags. Teeth found flesh. Screams became constant. Leonidas fought, blade, bolter, fist, stone. He became a thing of movement and will, answering every intrusion with violence shaped by purpose. Men locked into the rhythm with him. They did not look at the sky. They did not count the dead. They held. The scarred soldier was dragged down by a creature that burst from below ground. Leonidas fired into the writhing mass until it collapsed, dragging the man free by the edge of his armor. Blood poured from rents in flesh and cloth. "You don't get to die today," Leonidas said, though the words meant nothing. The man's eyes understood. The sky grew darker. A shadow passed overhead. A bioship, massive, alive. It blocked the burning clouds, its belly pulsing with unnatural light. Organic tendrils extended, firing spines that punched through the fortress walls. Sections of the cathedral exploded outward, releasing gouts of flame and falling stone. The commissar shouted orders no one could hear. The guns turned upward. Fire raked the air. The shadow did not stop. Leonidas felt the ground shake as the fortress took a direct hit. A tower collapsed. Hundreds of men vanished in smoke and stone. The line bent, not broke, bent. He stepped forward into the breach alone, turning, firing, shouting wordless sounds that carried through the chaos. Men surged to him instinctively. The banner of the unbroken, tattered and blackened, was dragged forward and twisted into the dirt beside him. They rallied around it. Not for the emperor, not for terror, for each other, for standing. The swarm broke against them. Not fully, never fully, but enough. Enough to survive a breath longer, or a heartbeat. The sky split. Something fell from orbit, burning so brightly it turned the battlefield white. A spear of light. A response. The bioship writhed as the beam tore through its flesh. It screamed. The sound shook bone. It ruptured, spilling burning ichor across the heavens. The shadow burned away. The swarm faltered. For a heartbeat. A ragged cheer tried to rise and died in choking throats. The line did not move, because they knew better. More would come. Leonidas stood amid the ruin, armor shattered, blood running freely down his side, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of smoke and fire. The commissar approached through falling ash. "You should be dead," he said. Leonidas almost smiled. "I was," he thought, inwardly. The sky burned. The world screamed. The line held. And as the first distant rumble of another wave began to rise from beyond the horizon, Leonidas asked himself one last terrible question that no world, no god, and no empire could ever truly answer. How many times can a man stand before even legend turns to dust? The second wave did not need to be seen. Leonidas felt it in the way the air tightened, in the way the earth below his feet seemed to stiffen, as if bracing for something it had endured too many times. The sky above burned with a low, constant fury, streaked by falling debris and distant, dying stars of weapon fire. The men along the line did not speak. They did not pray. They did not scream. They simply reset their grips, reloaded shaken magazines, and stood. Behind them, the fortress still burned, its great cathedral walls cracked and bleeding fire from within. Great gaps had been torn into its sides like open wounds that would never close. The statues that had once crowned its towers lay scattered across the battlefield, their shattered faces half buried in mud and bone. Leonidas stood at the raw heart of it all. The banner of the Unbroken hung in tatters beside him, its cloth scorched, its image blackened and half gone, yet still recognizable. The scarred soldier knelt nearby, gasping shallowly with every breath, hands still locked around his weapon as if he no longer remembered how to let go. "You won't make it out of this," the man said quietly. Leonidas knew. The ground began to tremble. This was no charge of creatures, no thunder of hooves, no stampede of monstrous flesh. This was a march, heavy, measured. From beyond the smoke came silhouettes, huge, broad, perfectly upright, Astartes, not the twisted traitors of before. These were different. Their armor was a muted gold, burned by countless wars, marked by the scars of devotion and devastation alike. Their weapons were held in disciplined silence. Their helms bore the mark of a chapter that carried no warmth, only purpose, the Imperium's final answer. The men of the guard shifted, not in fear of these giants, but in understanding. Relief was not allowed. Salvation was simply another kind of war. Leonidas stepped forward, bloodied hand lowering his weapon slightly. One of the giants removed his helm. His face was pale, scarred, and older than most civilizations. His eyes rested on Leonidas without curiosity. "You will not be taken from here," the Astartes said. "You will be remembered as lost." Leonidas inclined his head. That was enough. The giant continued. "You will be recorded as a stand that delayed extinction." Leonidas looked back at the men behind him, the scarred soldier, the wounded, the broken, the living. None of them expected rescue. None of them expected reward. They expected to die standing. The Astartes turned away. "We will hold what remains." The ground trembled again, but this time it was not the enemy. It was the world beginning to tear itself apart under the weight of too much war. Deep, violent cracks split the battlefield. Poisoned steam roared from the depths. The sky began to warp, bending light around a growing wound of unnatural color. The warp was clawing at the veil. Reality was thinning. The Astartes raised their weapons upward, firing into the growing rupture, not to destroy, but to delay. The commissar moved through the ranks. He stopped near Leonidas. "You have inspired too much," he said. "Too many men will die harder because of you." Leonidas looked at him. "And yet," the commissar added quieter, "not one of them would trade it away." It was the closest thing to praise he would ever give. The first creature emerged from the fissure in the sky. Not heretic, not Xenos, something else. A thing of twisting limbs and screaming void, half-formed, clawing its way into existence with effortless hatred. Leonidas raised his weapon once more. The men behind him did the same. The Astartes fired in perfect, thunderous unison. The creature recoiled, tearing back into the wound. But more stirred behind it. The sky was tearing open. The world was losing. The Imperium was losing. This was not a battle that could be won. It was only a moment that could be chosen. Leonidas stepped forward one last time. He felt no fear. He felt no anger. Only the quiet certainty of a man who had done what he was made to do. He lifted the banner, wrapping its torn cloth around his forearm, not as a symbol, but as a promise. The men surged with him. They did not shout. They did not cry. They ran. They fired. They died. The light from the warp lie grew brighter, more furious, screaming as reality split at its edges. Figures began to pour through, clawing, crawling, tearing. Bolter fire filled the air. Screams followed. Blood followed. Then silence began to fall in pieces. Not peaceful, not merciful. Final. Somewhere far above, within a vast and uncaring Imperium, a report would be written. A line would be added to a ledger of uncountable losses. A nameless stand. A forgotten world. A delay of extinction measured in minutes. They would not write his name. They would not know it. They would not understand it. And yet, down in the screaming wound of a dying world, Leonidas of Sparta stood until the last heartbeat, the last breath, the last memory of light. The warp swallowed the sky. The ground cracked fully. The fortress vanished in fire and collapse. Silence came, not as peace, but as the absence of resistance, and far away, in the cold and endless dark of humanity's empire, a dangerous truth lingered unspoken. Some legends could not be marked as heresy. Some courage could not be executed. Some spirits could not be broken. But the Imperium, in all its relentless cruelty, could never allow such truths to be celebrated. Only hidden, only buried, only remembered in whispers, and in the final, fading echo of a dead world, one final question hung unanswered, drifting through eternity like ash upon a doomed wind. Did the Imperium save him, or did it lose something it could never afford to forget?